I never believed the stories about the Wendigo. To me, they were nothing more than old Native American legends people told around campfires to make the night feel a little darker. I had spent years hiking through forests across the United States and nothing unusual had ever happened to me. That changed last January. There were 4 of us when we entered the northern forest. We planned a simple weekend hike through a remote area that wasn't supposed to be dangerous. The weather forecast predicted light snow and we packed enough food for 2 days. Everything seemed normal. The first day went exactly as planned. The second day didn't. Sometime during the night, a blizzard rolled in without warning. By morning, the trail had completely disappeared beneath fresh snow. Every tree looked exactly the same. Our GPS couldn't lock onto a signal, and even the compass refused to settle, spinning slowly as if it couldn't decide which way was north. At first, none of us panicked. We assumed we'd eventually find the trail again. Hours passed, then more hours. The sun began to disappear behind thick gray clouds, and we realized we had been walking in circles. That evening, we counted what little food remained. It wasn't enough, not even close. The cold became unbearable after sunset. Every breath felt like needles inside my lungs. We built a small fire beneath a group of pine trees, but it barely produced any heat. None of us slept very much. I remember waking sometime after midnight because I heard my younger brother calling my name. The sound was faint, almost carried by the wind. I immediately sat up. The strange part wasn't hearing his voice. The strange part was that he was sleeping only a few feet away from me. I could clearly see him lying beside the dying fire. Yet his voice continued drifting through the darkness between the trees. I convinced myself exhaustion was making me imagine things. Eventually, I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention it. I didn't want everyone else to think I was losing my mind. But later that afternoon, my brother quietly admitted something that made my stomach tighten. He had heard our mother's voice during the night. She had died almost 7 years earlier. Neither of us knew what to say after that. As daylight faded again, we found the remains of an old campsite buried beneath the snow. The tent had collapsed years ago. Rust covered every piece of metal. Near the frozen fire pit, I discovered a leather journal. Most of the pages had been destroyed by moisture, but a few sentences were still readable. One line immediately caught my attention. It warned never to follow familiar voices in the forest. Another warned never to eat food that appeared where no hunter had been. I remember thinking the journal belonged to someone who had simply gone insane after becoming lost. Then we found the deer. It lay in perfect condition less than 30 feet from the campsite. Fresh, untouched, no blood, no tracks, no signs of wolves, no sign that anything had dragged it there. It looked as though it had simply appeared in the snow. One of my friends wanted to cut it open immediately. Something deep inside me refused. I couldn't explain why. Every instinct I had told me to keep walking, so we did. Looking back now, I wish we had kept walking much faster. That night I barely slept. The forest felt wrong. It wasn't simply quiet. It was empty. No wind, no birds, no distant animals. Just silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat inside my ears. Sometime before dawn, I woke again. One of our sleeping bags was empty. My friend had disappeared. Fresh footprints led away from camp. Bare human footprints, no boots, no socks, just bare feet pressed into the snow despite the freezing temperature. We followed them. I wish we hadn't. The trail led directly back to the dead deer. My friend was kneeling beside it. His back faced us. At first, I thought he was trying to drag the animal. Then he slowly lifted his head. His face was covered with dark stains. He looked thinner than he had only hours before. His skin had become pale. His eyes seemed wrong, almost too deep inside his skull. He slowly stood. Something about the way he moved terrified me. His joints didn't seem to bend naturally anymore. His smile stretched far wider than it should have. Before any of us could move, every sound in the forest disappeared. Even our breathing seemed strangely quiet. That's when I noticed something standing between the trees behind him. At first, I mistook it for another pine trunk. Then it moved. It was impossibly tall. Its body looked skeletal, with impossibly long arms hanging almost to the ground. Pale gray skin stretched tightly over its frame. Massive antlers rose above its head like dead branches disappearing into the darkness. The thing never rushed toward us. It simply watched. I had the overwhelming feeling that it already knew exactly how this would end. Then I heard my brother call my name again. The voice came from somewhere behind me. I spun around, nothing. When I looked back toward the creature, it had moved several yards closer. I never saw it take a single step. That was enough. I ran, the others ran too. Branches snapped somewhere behind us. Not one at a time, hundreds. Whatever chased us moved through the forest faster than anything that size should have been able to. I never looked back again. Eventually, I reached the road alone. A snowplow driver found me wandering along the shoulder just after sunrise. He asked where my friends were. I couldn't answer, not because I didn't want to, because I honestly didn't know. Search teams spent nearly 2 weeks looking for them. They found backpacks. They found pieces of camping gear. They even found our abandoned campsite, but they never found a single body. It's been almost 3 years since that trip. People still tell me I was lucky to survive. Sometimes I almost believe them. But every winter, when the first heavy snow begins to fall, I hear my brother calling my name outside my house. The voice always comes from the tree line. It sounds exactly the way it did that night. Sometimes it even sounds closer than before. And lately, I've started wondering if it isn't trying to lure me back. I've started wondering if it's simply coming to finish what it began. I've spent most of my life exploring abandoned places. Ghost towns, forgotten mines, empty roads in the middle of nowhere, those were the places I loved the most. I never went looking for ghosts. I simply enjoyed filming locations that most people avoided. Last autumn, I drove into the Arizona desert to record an old abandoned settlement that had been empty for decades. The nearest town was almost 40 miles away. And by the time I finished filming, the sun was already disappearing behind the mountains. I wasn't worried. I had made the drive dozens of times before. The desert becomes strangely beautiful after sunset. The air cools almost instantly. The wind disappears and everything becomes so quiet that even your own footsteps sound too loud. I decided to walk a little farther before heading back to my truck. That decision still haunts me. About 20 minutes later, I noticed footprints in the sand at first. Nothing seemed unusual. They were human footprints. The strange part was where they appeared. They started in the middle of an open stretch of desert. There were no tracks leading to them, just one set of footprints that began as if someone had suddenly appeared out of thin air. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed them for several hundred yards. They continued in a perfectly straight line, then they simply stopped. There was nothing ahead, no rocks, no bushes, no cliffs. The footprints ended in the middle of empty sand. I remember standing there for almost a full minute, trying to understand what I was seeing. That's when I felt something watching me. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't movement. It was that instinctive feeling you get when someone is staring directly at your back. I slowly turned around. The desert was completely empty, at least. That's what I thought as I started walking back toward my truck. I noticed someone standing far away on a ridge. The figure didn't move. It was too far away to make out any details. I assumed it was another hiker. I even lifted one hand to wave. The figure never reacted. I kept walking. Every few minutes I glanced over my shoulder. It was always there, always standing perfectly still. When I finally reached my truck, I felt relieved. I threw my backpack inside, started the engine, and drove away without giving it another thought. About 15 minutes later, I checked my rearview mirror. The same figure was standing beside the road. That shouldn't have been possible. I had driven several miles without stopping. There was no way anyone could have reached that spot on foot. I told myself it wasn't the same person. The desert plays tricks on your eyes. That's what I wanted to believe. When I arrived home, I transferred the footage from my camera onto my computer. Everything looked normal until I reached one clip filmed near the footprints. The camera had captured something I never noticed while I was there. Behind me, less than 50 feet away, stood another person. He was wearing clothes almost identical to mine. Same dark jacket, same backpack, same baseball cap. The camera angle wasn't clear enough to see his face. I froze the video, frame by frame. The stranger copied every movement I made. Whenever I bent down, he bent down. Whenever I turned my head, he did the same. The only difference was timing. He always moved a second later. I spent hours convincing myself it had to be some kind of visual glitch. Then I zoomed in. His backpack was on the wrong shoulder. Everything about him looked like a reflection, not another person, a mirror image. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked outside to collect my mail. Someone had left fresh footprints across my front yard, bare footprints. They led to my front door, but there were no footprints leading away. For weeks, strange things kept happening. I would hear footsteps outside my bedroom window after midnight. My security cameras occasionally activated without recording anyone, more than once. I caught movement in the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there. When I turned, I stopped hiking. I stopped filming. I tried to convince myself the stress was making me paranoid. Then I saw it again. I was driving home from work one evening when I noticed someone walking along the side of the highway. He looked exactly like me, the same height, the same clothes, even the same way of walking, with a slight limp in my left leg from an old injury. I slowed the truck for just a second. He turned his head toward me. My heart nearly stopped. He had my face. Not one feature was different, except for the smile. It stretched far wider than any human smile should. Before I could react, he dropped onto all fours, his arms twisted backward with a sickening fluid motion. and he sprinted into the darkness with impossible speed, moving more like a starving animal than a person. I never told anyone. Who would believe me? Months passed before I thought it was finally over. Then one night my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my own number. I answered without thinking. There was no voice, only breathing, slow, calm, patient. The call ended after about 20 seconds when I checked my call history. There was no record of it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined everything. Life eventually returned to normal, or at least I thought it had, until last week. I was organizing old files on my computer when I opened that desert footage again. This time I noticed something I had completely missed before. The camera had briefly captured my truck in the distance. Someone was already sitting in the driver's seat. I was still standing nearly 100 yards away. Filming, that means whatever had been following me reached my truck before I did. I don't know whether it entered the vehicle with me that night. I don't know if it followed me home. What scares me most is another possibility. Maybe it never followed me at all. Maybe it was already pretending to be me before I ever left the desert. Lately, people at work have started asking why I seem different. They tell me I smile more now. The strange thing is, I don't remember smiling at all. I never cared much about urban legends. Whenever people talked about strange creatures or supernatural sightings, I always assumed there had to be a reasonable explanation. Someone had seen an owl in the dark, mistaken a shadow for a person, or let fear fill in the details. That's exactly what I believed until one night changed everything. It happened late in October. I had been visiting a friend in a small town and left much later than I planned. The fastest way home was an old two-lane highway that crossed a long steel bridge over a wide river. The road was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and after midnight there were almost no other cars for nearly an hour. I had the entire road to myself. The silence inside the car felt strange. No radio, no traffic, only the sound of the tires rolling across the pavement. About 10 miles before the bridge, I noticed something unusual. The forest had become completely still, even with the windows closed. I realized I couldn't hear insects anymore, no crickets, no frogs, nothing. The silence felt unnatural, as if every living thing had disappeared at the same time. A few minutes later, my headlights caught two tiny red lights in the distance. At first I assumed they were reflectors mounted on a road sign, but they weren't. As I got closer, they remained perfectly level with each other, too high above the ground to belong to any animal, too far apart to be someone's flashlight. I slowed down. The lights didn't move, then they blinked, not like electric lights, like eyes. I laughed nervously and convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was standing near the road wearing reflective glasses. Maybe I was simply tired. I kept driving. When I reached the bridge, the red eyes were gone. I felt embarrassed for letting my imagination get the better of me. Halfway across the bridge, my headlights suddenly flickered, then my dashboard went black. The engine died without warning. The steering wheel became heavy in my hands as the car rolled to a stop. I tried restarting it. Nothing, not even a clicking sound. It was as if the battery had vanished. I reached for my phone. No signal, no service. The battery indicator, which had shown nearly 80% less than 10 minutes earlier, now displayed 1% before I could react. The screen turned black. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Something landed on the bridge. The sound wasn't loud. It was heavy, a deep metallic impact that echoed through the steel beneath the car. Another impact followed, closer. Then another. Each one made the bridge vibrate slightly beneath my feet. I looked through the windshield. At first I couldn't see anything. Then two glowing red eyes slowly appeared above the roof of my car. They were much higher than any person's head should have been. My entire body froze. The eyes never blinked. They simply watched me. A dark shape unfolded behind them. Wings, massive wings, far larger than any bird I'd ever seen. The creature remained almost completely hidden in darkness. I could only make out its outline whenever thin moonlight broke through the clouds. It stood upright. Its shoulders were unnaturally broad. Its wings stretched across nearly the entire width of the bridge. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then my car started by itself. The dashboard lights came back on. The engine roared to life. I didn't think. I slammed the accelerator to the floor. In the rearview mirror, I caught one final glimpse of the creature. It never chased me. It simply remained standing on the bridge, watching as I disappeared into the darkness. When I finally reached home, I barely slept. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to convince myself there had been another explanation. Maybe it had been a large bird. Maybe stress and exhaustion had distorted what I saw. The next morning, I turned on the television while making coffee. The local news interrupted its regular programming. During the night, the very bridge I had crossed had partially collapsed after a major structural failure. Emergency crews were already searching the river below. Several vehicles had fallen into the water. Authorities couldn't yet determine exactly when the collapse had begun. I remember dropping my coffee mug onto the floor. The timing didn't make sense. I had crossed the bridge only minutes before the disaster, for weeks afterward. I tried forgetting what I had seen. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least it appeared to. Then strange things started happening whenever I drove at night. I felt as though something was flying above the tree line beside the road. Sometimes I caught a moving shadow gliding silently over my car whenever I stopped to look. The sky was empty months later. Curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to the bridge. Most of it had already been demolished. Construction crews were preparing to rebuild the crossing. As I stood behind the safety barriers, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Several workers were staring toward the far end of the river. Not one of them was speaking. I followed their gaze. High above the unfinished steel beams stood two familiar red eyes, perfectly motionless, watching. The strange part wasn't that I saw them again. The strange part was what happened next. Every worker slowly turned around and walked away. No panic, no shouting, just quiet, as if they had all silently agreed never to mention what they had seen. I almost convinced myself to do the same, almost, because ever since that night, I've started noticing a pattern whenever a major disaster appears on the news. Whenever a bridge collapses, whenever a building suddenly fails, whenever an entire town is evacuated without explanation, I always see the same red eyes a day or two beforehand. Sometimes they're standing on a rooftop, sometimes at the edge of a forest, sometimes reflected in the glass of my office window 20 floors above the street. They never move toward me. They never attack, they only watch. I spent years believing the creature was warning people. Now I don't think that's true anymore. Warnings are meant to save lives. This thing never tries to stop anything. It only arrives first, as if it's waiting, as if it already knows exactly what's about to happen. And the worst part is, yesterday morning, while leaving for work, I looked across the street. The red eyes were there again. They weren't watching the city. They weren't watching my neighborhood. For the first time, they were watching my house. I grew up hearing stories about a spirit that lived deep inside the old forests. My grandfather never called it a monster. He always described it as the owner of the woods. According to him, every tree, every animal, and every trail belonged to something ancient that had existed long before people built roads or towns. He used to tell me that the forest was alive, and that sometimes it decided whether someone deserved to leave. I laughed every time he told me those stories. Until I experienced something I still can't explain. It happened during an autumn camping trip. I had chosen an isolated national forest because I wanted to spend a weekend away from civilization. I planned to record nature videos, photograph wildlife, and enjoy the silence. The first day was perfect. Golden leaves covered the ground. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees and the forest felt peaceful. I spent hours hiking without seeing another person. Late that afternoon, I noticed something strange. The birds had disappeared. I hadn't realized how much background noise birds create until it suddenly stopped. No singing, no wings, nothing. The silence felt heavy, almost as if the entire forest was listening. I ignored it and continued hiking. About an hour later, I reached an old wooden trail marker. Someone had carved dozens of names into it over the years. Mine was among them, at least I thought it was. I walked closer. It wasn't exactly my name. One letter was different. I laughed to myself and assumed someone with a similar name had passed through years earlier. Still, seeing it in such a remote place made me uncomfortable. I kept walking. Within another 20 minutes, I found the exact same trail marker again, the same cracked wood, the same broken corner, the same carved name. I checked my GPS, according to the map. I had been walking in a straight line. There was no way I could have returned to the same place. I turned around immediately. This time I paid close attention to every landmark: a fallen tree, a large moss-covered boulder, a twisted pine growing sideways. An hour later, I found the trail marker again. That's when I realized something was terribly wrong. Panic started creeping into my thoughts. I stopped trusting my sense of direction. The forest suddenly looked different. Every tree seemed taller. The shadows appeared darker. The distance between the trunks somehow felt deeper as evening approached. I decided to stay where I was and wait until sunrise. I built a small fire and tried convincing myself that exhaustion was making me imagine things. Night came quickly, much faster than it should have. The darkness between the trees became almost solid. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, not the footsteps of a deer, not a bear, something walking upright. The sound circled my camp but never entered the firelight. I held my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. Several minutes passed. Then I heard branches creaking high above me. I looked up. Something impossibly large was moving through the tops of the trees, not climbing, walking. The treetops bent one after another as though something enormous was stepping from one tree to the next. Whatever it was never came into view. I only saw the forest moving around it. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, I packed everything and started walking immediately. I wasn't interested in finishing the trip anymore. I only wanted to reach my truck. Hours passed. The trail became narrower. Eventually it disappeared completely. The forest looked untouched. There wasn't a single footprint besides my own. Then I noticed someone standing between two trees. He was so perfectly still that I almost mistook him for part of the forest. His body looked as though it had grown from bark. Long roots wrapped around his legs. Moss covered his shoulders. Small branches extended from his arms like fingers. His face looked almost human, almost. The skin resembled cracked wood, the eyes glowed with a faint amber light. He wasn't threatening me, he wasn't chasing me, he was simply watching. I backed away slowly. The moment I blinked, he was gone. I started running. Branches whipped against my face. Roots caught my boots. Several times I could have sworn I heard footsteps matching my own somewhere behind me whenever I stopped. The forest became silent again. Hours later, I finally reached a dirt road. Relief washed over me. I had made it out, or at least I believed I had. My truck was exactly where I had left it. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back for weeks afterward. I convinced myself everything had been caused by stress. Getting lost can make people hallucinate. That's what I kept telling myself. Then the dreams started. Every night I dreamed of the same forest. Every dream ended the same way. I would see the figure standing between the trees. He never moved. He only watched. Little by little, strange things began happening at home. Leaves appeared on my bedroom floor every morning. Fresh pine needles collected beneath my bed. Once I found damp soil on my kitchen table despite every window being locked. I stopped sleeping well. Sometimes I woke because I thought I heard trees swaying outside, even on completely windless nights. Then, last month, something happened that finally convinced me I had never truly escaped. I was driving home after work when traffic came to a complete stop. Road construction had closed one lane. As I waited, I happened to glance toward a small patch of woodland beside the highway. Standing between two trees was the same figure. The same bark-covered face. The same glowing amber eyes, exactly as I had seen him months before. Cars continued driving. No one reacted. No one seemed to notice him except me. He slowly raised one hand, not in greeting, not as a threat, more like someone calling another person home. When traffic began moving again, I looked away for only a second. He was gone. I wish I could tell myself it was over. I wish I could believe I simply imagined everything. But every year since that camping trip, something has changed. Plants in my yard grow faster than they should. Birds gather on my roof without making a sound, and every autumn, I feel an overwhelming urge to return to that forest. The feeling gets stronger every year. Sometimes I catch myself searching for maps of the area without remembering opening my computer. Sometimes I wake with dirt beneath my fingernails. I honestly don't know if I sleepwalk anymore. What scares me most isn't the possibility that something followed me home. It's the possibility that a part of me never left the forest at all, and one day, I'm afraid I'll stop trying to resist going back. I used to think every legend came from a real place. Maybe the stories changed over hundreds of years. Maybe people exaggerated what they had seen. But I always believed that somewhere beneath every myth there was at least a small piece of truth. That belief is the reason I drove into one of the oldest forests in Eastern Europe. I was filming a documentary about forgotten folklore. My plan was simple: visit a few abandoned villages, record local stories, and spend one night in the forest before heading home. The last village I visited had only a handful of elderly residents left. Almost every house was empty. The roads were slowly disappearing beneath grass. One old woman listened quietly while I explained what I was filming. She never laughed. She never told me the stories were nonsense. Instead, she became strangely serious when I mentioned Baba Yaga. She told me that people always searched for her in the wrong places. According to her, Baba Yaga didn't live in the forest became hers whenever she decided to visit it. At the time, I thought she was simply speaking poetically. Now I think she was trying to warn me. I entered the woods shortly before sunset. The trees were ancient. Some of them were so large I couldn't wrap both arms around their trunks. Everything smelled of damp earth, old leaves, and pine needles. It was beautiful, peaceful. For the first 2 hours, nothing unusual happened. I found a clearing beside a narrow stream and pitched my tent. The forest became completely silent after dark. I expected to hear owls or insects. Instead, there was absolutely nothing. The silence felt unnatural, almost as though every living creature had suddenly left. Around midnight, I woke without knowing why. The fire had gone out. The air felt colder. Then I noticed something impossible. there was another house standing in the clearing. It hadn't been there when I fell asleep. I was certain of that. It stood less than 50 feet from my tent. The walls looked ancient. Built from dark, weathered logs, the roof sagged with age. A single window glowed with warm, orange light. For several minutes I simply stared at it. I convinced myself I had somehow missed it before nightfall. That explanation lasted until I noticed the ground beneath it. There were no foundations, no stone supports. The entire house stood several feet above the earth, balanced on two enormous bird-like legs. They looked weathered like old tree roots. Yet every few moments one of them shifted slightly, scraping against the ground with a slow wooden creak. I couldn't move. Every story I had heard as a child came rushing back into my mind. The house slowly turned, not because someone pushed it. The legs themselves stepped forward, one at a time. The entire cabin rotated until the front door faced directly toward me. Then the door opened by itself. No one appeared. The light inside remained warm and inviting, against every instinct I had. I stepped closer. I don't know why. It didn't feel like curiosity anymore. It felt as though something inside the house wanted me to enter. The moment I crossed the doorway, the smell changed outside. The forest smelled fresh inside. The air carried the scent of dried herbs, smoke, old wood, and something I couldn't identify. The room looked surprisingly ordinary. A wooden table, shelves filled with glass jars, bundles of hanging plants, a kettle resting above a small fire. Everything looked as though someone had been living there only moments earlier. Yet the entire cabin was empty. I slowly walked through the single room. On one wall hung dozens of old mirrors. Everyone reflected me, except one, in that mirror. I wasn't alone. An old woman stood directly behind me. She was impossibly thin. Her gray hair hung almost to the floor. Her face looked ancient enough to belong to someone hundreds of years old. Before I could turn around, the reflection smiled. I spun around. No one was there. The room was empty again. My heartbeat was so loud I could barely hear anything else. I rushed toward the door. It wouldn't open, not because it was locked, because it wasn't there anymore. The wall where the entrance had been was now solid wood. Every window showed only darkness. No stars, no trees, just endless blackness. Hours seemed to pass. I searched every inch of the cabin looking for another exit. Instead, I found something else, dozens of carved wooden figures. Each one represented a person. Every face was different. Every expression looked terrified. One figure caught my attention immediately. It looked exactly like me. It hadn't been there earlier. I was certain of it as I reached toward it. I noticed tiny fresh scratches appearing across the wood. They formed slowly, one line at a time, without anyone touching it. The scratches climbed from the figure's feet toward its face. At the same time, my left leg began to ache, then my arm, then my shoulder. I looked down. Thin red marks were appearing across my own skin in exactly the same places. I backed away immediately. The pain stopped, so did the carving. I never touched the figure again. Eventually, exhaustion overcame panic. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking suddenly to birds singing. Bright sunlight filled the room. The cabin was gone. I was lying inside my tent exactly where I had fallen asleep the night before. The clearing looked completely normal. There were no giant footprints. No strange house. No broken branches. Nothing. For several weeks I convinced myself I had experienced an unusually vivid nightmare. Then I reviewed the footage from my camera. The final video clip had been recorded automatically sometime during the night. It showed my tent exactly as I remembered it. Then, after several seconds, something enormous stepped into frame. Two gigantic bird-like legs walked past the camera. The image shook with every step. A wooden cabin slowly crossed in front of the lens. Its windows glowed softly as it disappeared into the darkness. One upstairs window remained visible for just a moment. Someone was standing inside, watching the camera, watching me. I enlarged the image hundreds of times. The face was too blurry to identify, but one detail was perfectly clear. The person standing in that window was wearing my jacket. I deleted the footage that same day, or at least I tried to, every few months. It somehow reappears on my hard drive, always with a different file name. Always recorded at exactly the same time, 2:17 in the morning. I no longer watch it because the last time I did, the figure in the window wasn't standing anymore. It was walking toward the glass, and I'm terrified that one day, it won't be looking out of the cabin anymore. It'll be looking in through my bedroom window. I never believed in omens. People like to connect random events after something terrible happens. They remember strange dreams, unusual noises, or a feeling that something was wrong, and suddenly everything becomes part of a story. That's exactly how I explained what happened to me. At first, 3 years ago, I moved into a small cottage on the outskirts of an old Irish village. I had accepted a remote engineering job and wanted somewhere quiet to live for a while. The village was peaceful, surrounded by rolling hills, narrow stone roads, and fields that disappeared into thick morning fog. Everyone seemed friendly. Everyone except the elderly man who owned the cottage. The day he handed me the keys, he looked down the road behind me instead of into my eyes. He seemed distracted, uneasy. Before leaving, he quietly told me that if I ever heard a horse riding through the village after midnight, I should stay away from the windows. I smiled politely. I assumed it was another local superstition. For nearly 2 months, nothing unusual happened. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Every evening I took the same walk through the village before returning home. Every night I fell asleep listening to the wind moving through the old trees. Then one night I woke to a sound I had never heard before. Horse hooves, slow, heavy. Each step echoed across the stone road outside my house. It wasn't the fast rhythm of someone riding home. It sounded deliberate, measured, as if whoever was riding wanted every step to be heard. I checked the time. 12:03 a.m. The sound grew louder until it seemed to stop directly outside my front gate. I sat in bed for almost a minute. Listening, then nothing, complete silence. Eventually I convinced myself someone had simply ridden past. The next morning, I walked outside expecting to see hoofprints in the mud. There weren't any. The ground was perfectly untouched. I forgot about it until the following week. The horse returned, exactly 12 minutes after midnight. This time the sound lasted longer. The rider moved slowly through the village before stopping outside my house once again. The silence afterward felt even stranger than the footsteps themselves. No horse breathing, no saddle creaking, nothing. I almost walked to the window. Something stopped me. Maybe it was the old man's warning. Maybe it was instinct. Whatever the reason, I stayed in bed until sunrise over the following month. It happened again and again, always after midnight, always stopping outside my home, always leaving no tracks behind. I started asking people in the village whether anyone rode horses at night. Every conversation ended the same way. People changed the subject or simply walked away. No one wanted to discuss it. One rainy evening I visited the village cemetery to photograph several old Celtic gravestones. Near the back of the cemetery stood a weathered monument unlike the others. Instead of a name, it displayed only the carving of a horse. Beneath it someone had engraved a sentence. When he speaks your name, do not answer. There was no date. No explanation, just those words. For the first time, I felt genuinely uneasy that night. I locked every door in the house. I closed every curtain. Just after midnight, the horse returned. The hooves stopped closer than ever before, right outside my front door. I held my breath, then I heard something else. Not a voice, not exactly. It sounded more like someone whispering through dead leaves. My name, perfectly clear, perfectly calm. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I somehow knew the sound wasn't entering through my ears. It felt as though it had appeared directly inside my mind. Every instinct told me not to respond. I remained completely still. The whisper came again. My name, slower this time. Almost patient, several seconds later, the horse began walking away. The following morning I found something lying beside my front steps, a single black feather. It wasn't from any bird I recognized. It was unusually long and strangely cold to the touch despite the warm sunlight. I threw it into my fireplace. It burned instantly. The ashes formed the outline of a horse's head before collapsing. That was the moment I decided to leave the village. I packed everything the next afternoon, loaded my car, said goodbye to my landlord. I didn't tell him why. He already seemed to know. The road leading out of the village crossed a narrow stone bridge, halfway across. Traffic came to a complete stop. An accident further ahead blocked the road. Cars lined up in both directions. There was nowhere to turn around. As evening slowly became night, a heavy fog rolled across the hills. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Then I heard it, horse hooves, not behind me, ahead, moving toward the line of stopped vehicles. Nobody else reacted. Drivers continued looking at their phones. Some stepped outside their cars. It was as if I was the only person who could hear it. The sound grew louder, closer, closer, until it stopped directly beside my driver's window. Against every instinct, I looked. A massive black horse stood less than 6 feet away. Its eyes reflected no light. Its breath drifted through the cold air like smoke. Seated upon it was a rider dressed entirely in dark armor worn smooth with age. Where a head should have been, there was nothing. The rider held something beneath one arm. Slowly, almost gently, he lifted it. His own head, its pale eyes opened. They looked directly into mine. The lips began to move. I couldn't hear a sound. Yet somehow, I knew it was speaking my name again. I shut my eyes. I don't know how long I stayed like that. When I finally opened them, the traffic had started moving. The horse was gone. The fog was lifting. I drove for nearly 6 hours without stopping. I never returned to that village. Sometimes I wonder whether refusing to answer saved me. Then I remember something else. Ever since that night, I no longer dream. Not once, not ever. It's as though something took every dream I would have had last week. While cleaning old boxes in my attic, I found a photograph I don't remember taking. It showed my old cottage. Parked outside was my car. Standing beside it was a black horse. The rider wasn't visible, but someone was sitting in my driver's seat. The photo was taken from outside the car, looking through the windshield. Whoever was inside had both hands on the steering wheel. Their face was hidden in shadow, except for one detail. They were holding something in their lap, a human head, and even though the image was too dark to recognize the face, I somehow knew exactly whose head it was. It was mine. I grew up in a small village on the western coast of Ireland, where people treated old legends differently than most places. They didn't tell them to scare children. They treated them like weather, something that simply existed. My grandmother used to say there was one sound you should never follow after dark. The crying of a woman you couldn't see. She never called it a ghost. She never called it a monster. She only said that if you heard her weeping, someone nearby was going to die. I spent most of my life believing she was repeating an old superstition. Until last November. I had returned to the village after almost 15 years away. My parents had both passed, and I needed to empty the old family house before selling it. The place hadn't changed much since my childhood. The same narrow roads, the same stone walls, the same cold wind coming from the ocean every evening. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time sorting through dusty boxes, old photographs and furniture that hadn't been touched in decades. Then one night, just after midnight, I heard someone crying. It wasn't loud. It sounded distant, soft enough that I almost mistook it for the wind, but the longer I listened, the more certain I became someone was sobbing outside. It wasn't the kind of crying you hear after an argument. It sounded hopeless. The kind of grief that comes after someone realizes nothing will ever be the same again. I walked toward the front window just before pulling the curtain aside. I remembered what my grandmother had always told me: never look for the woman. I laughed at myself. I was 40 years old. Standing inside my own house, afraid of a story I had heard as a child, I opened the curtain. The road outside was empty. The crying stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse. The next morning, I learned that an elderly man who lived 3 houses away had died during the night. Everyone said it had been peaceful. Natural causes. I didn't think much about the coincidence. A week later, I heard the crying again. This time it came from behind the house. The sound drifted through the garden, somewhere beyond the old apple trees. I almost ignored it. Instead, I walked outside carrying a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating damp grass and low stone walls, nothing else. Then I noticed something white near the edge of the property. Someone stood there, completely motionless. Long gray hair covered most of her face. Her white dress moved slightly in the wind. She seemed impossibly thin. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then she slowly raised one hand, not toward me, toward the house. The crying stopped. I blinked. She was gone. The next afternoon, I received a phone call. A close friend I'd worked with for years had died unexpectedly from a heart attack. He was only 46. That was the first time I began wondering if the stories were true. I stopped sleeping well. Every night I found myself listening for that distant crying. Some nights I heard nothing. Other nights, I wished I hadn't. The sound always came from a different direction. The beach, the hills, the cemetery, sometimes directly outside my bedroom window. Each time, someone died within a day or two. Always someone from the village, always someone I knew. The deaths never seemed connected. Different ages, different causes, different places. Only the crying remained the same. I started keeping a journal. I wrote down every date, every time I heard her, every funeral that followed. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Then one evening, something changed. The crying began before sunset. I'd never heard it during daylight. The sound was much closer than usual. It seemed to come from the old cemetery at the end of the road. Against my better judgment, I walked there. Rain had just begun to fall. The cemetery was empty, at least I thought it was. As I reached the oldest section, I noticed a woman kneeling beside one of the graves. Her long silver hair covered her face completely. She didn't seem to notice me. She simply continued crying. I looked down at the gravestone in front of her. It was freshly cleaned. No flowers, no candles, just a name. My name. My heart stopped. I checked the dates. The birth year was correct. The year of death was blank. The woman slowly stopped crying without lifting her head. She stood very slowly, almost unnaturally. Then she turned toward me. For the first time, I saw her face. Her skin was impossibly pale. Her eyes looked swollen from endless tears. But what terrified me most was her expression. She wasn't frightening. She wasn't angry. She looked heartbroken, as though she pitied me. I stumbled backward. When I looked up again, she was gone. Only the sound of distant crying remained. I left the village the following morning. I sold the house. I moved hundreds of miles away. For nearly a year, I convinced myself I had escaped whatever haunted that place. Then the crying returned, not outside, inside my dreams. Every dream begins the same way. I'm standing alone on an empty road at dusk, somewhere ahead. I hear a woman crying. I never see her. I always wake before I reach the sound. Until 3 nights ago, for the first time. I didn't wake up, I reached her. She was standing beside a gravestone. She stepped aside without saying a word. I looked down. The stone no longer had a blank date. This time, the date was tomorrow. I woke up gasping for air. I immediately checked the calendar. Tomorrow's date matched exactly. I've barely slept since then. I don't know whether dreams can predict the future. I don't know whether the Banshee truly mourns the people who are about to die, but while writing this, I can hear someone crying outside my window. The strange part isn't that she's back. The strange part is, for the first time, she sounds very close. Close enough that it almost feels like she's standing on my porch. And somehow, I don't think she's crying for me anymore. I think she's crying because whatever is coming has already arrived. I have always preferred traveling alone, no schedules, no tour groups, just a backpack, a camera, and whatever road happened to lead somewhere interesting a few years ago. I spent several weeks hiking through the mountains of rural Japan. I wanted to photograph places that rarely appeared in travel guides, forgotten villages, abandoned shrines, and old forest paths that had existed for centuries. One afternoon I made a mistake. I stayed on the trail much longer than I should have. By the time I realized how late it was, thick fog had already rolled through the mountains. The path became difficult to follow and my phone had completely lost its signal. I wasn't frightened at first. I had camping gear and enough supplies to spend the night outdoors if necessary. Then it started raining, not a light drizzle. A cold mountain rain that soaked everything within minutes. I searched for shelter and eventually noticed a small wooden house hidden among the trees. It looked surprisingly well maintained. Warm light glowed behind paper windows and thin smoke drifted from the chimney. I remember thinking how lucky I was. I knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately. Standing there was a young woman. She couldn't have been older than 30. She smiled politely and invited me inside with a gentle bow. She spoke very little English, and my Japanese wasn't much better. But we understood enough to communicate. She served tea, then a simple dinner. The food was excellent. The house itself felt peaceful. Everything smelled of cedar wood and fresh herbs. For the first hour, I forgot how lost I had been. Something began bothering me only after I finished eating. The house was too quiet. There were no insects outside, no wind against the walls, not even the sound of rain anymore, only silence. I excused myself and looked through one of the paper windows. The forest had disappeared. There was only fog, endless white fog in every direction. I checked my watch. It had stopped. The second hand was frozen between two numbers. I tapped the glass. Nothing. I pulled out my phone. The battery was dead. Less than an hour earlier, it had been fully charged. I tried convincing myself it was nothing more than bad luck. That's when I noticed something strange about the ceiling. Long white threads stretched from one wooden beam to another. At first I assumed they were old cobwebs. Then I saw one of them move, not because of the wind. It tightened, as if someone had gently pulled it. Another thread moved, then another. My eyes slowly followed them upward. The entire ceiling was covered. Thousands of impossibly thin strands crossed above my head. Every corner of the room disappeared beneath layers of silk. I hadn't noticed any of them when I first entered. The woman walked back into the room carrying another pot of tea. She smiled exactly as before. Calm, patient. Something about her eyes had changed. They no longer looked warm, they looked curious, like someone studying an animal trapped inside a cage. I thanked her and pretended to drink. The moment she turned away, I poured the tea onto the floor. The liquid hissed, the wooden boards darkened instantly where it landed. I don't know what was inside that cup. I never wanted to find out. I stood up and apologized, pretending I needed fresh air. She nodded, still smiling. I reached the front door. It wouldn't open, not because it was locked, because it wasn't there anymore. The wall where the entrance had been was now solid wood. My heartbeat became so loud I could barely hear anything else. I searched for another exit. Every hallway somehow led back into the same room. The house was changing. Rooms that hadn't existed moments earlier appeared behind sliding doors. Corridors stretched much farther than they should have. No matter which direction I walked, I always returned to the woman, still standing beside the table, still smiling. Eventually I looked up again. That was my biggest mistake. The threads covering the ceiling weren't attached to wooden beams. They disappeared into darkness above them. Something enormous shifted overhead. I heard the slow scrape of long legs moving across old timber. Dust drifted down around me. One thread brushed against my shoulder. It was sticky. Warm. I wiped it away and looked at my hand. The silk clung to my fingers like glue. More threads began lowering from the ceiling, not falling, descending purposefully. The woman took one slow step toward me. Her smile became wider, far too wide. The skin along both sides of her mouth seemed to stretch unnaturally. Then I noticed something moving beneath her kimono, not one movement, several, as though extra limbs were unfolding beneath the fabric. I backed away. She continued walking, slowly, never taking her eyes off me. One sleeve slipped slightly instead of an arm. I saw something long, black, and covered in fine hairs. It wasn't human. I ran. The house seemed determined to stop me. Hallways twisted, doors disappeared, every room looked identical. The silk became thicker with every step. It wrapped around my boots, my backpack, my hands. I tore through it as fast as I could. Then I saw moonlight, a window. I threw myself through it without thinking. The paper screen exploded as I crashed outside. I rolled down a steep hillside until I slammed into a tree. When I looked back, there was no house, only forest, only rain, only darkness. I somehow reached a mountain road before sunrise. A passing driver stopped and took me to the nearest town. When I described where I had spent the night, the man's expression changed immediately. He asked me to show him the location later that afternoon. We returned together. There was nothing there, no house, no chimney, no path leading to one, only an ancient stone foundation almost completely covered by moss, according to the locals. A house had once stood there more than 100 years ago. It had burned down, no one had lived there since. I tried to forget the experience. Eventually I almost succeeded, until 6 months later while editing my travel footage. I found several photographs I didn't remember taking. Every picture showed me sitting inside that house, smiling, drinking tea, looking directly into the camera. The strange thing was, I had been traveling alone. No one else was there to take the photographs. I deleted every image. The next morning they were back, but one detail had changed. The woman was no longer standing beside me. She was standing behind me in every picture, each time a little closer. I stopped opening the folder. I bought a new computer, transferred only the files I trusted. The photographs still appeared, always in a newly created folder, always with today's date, last night. I made the mistake of opening them again. There was only one photograph this time. I wasn't sitting in the old house anymore. I was asleep in my own bedroom. The picture had clearly been taken from inside the room. From the corner near the ceiling, looking down at my bed, I wasn't alone. Something with 8 impossibly long legs was hanging upside down above me. Its human face was smiling directly into the camera. I turned around immediately after seeing the photograph. Nothing was there, at least, nothing I could see. But ever since that night, every morning I wake up with a single strand of white silk stretched across my bedroom ceiling, and every morning, it's a little longer than it was the day before. I had never heard of Kuchisake-onna. I wasn't interested in Japanese folklore, and I certainly didn't believe that old ghost stories could follow someone into the real world. Everything changed during a business trip to Tokyo. I had been working there for almost 2 weeks, and most evenings I walked back to my hotel instead of taking the train. The streets were always busy enough that I never felt unsafe. One Friday night, I stayed at the office much later than usual. By the time I left, it was close to midnight. The city felt completely different. Most of the shops had closed. The sidewalks were nearly empty. Even the usual traffic had disappeared. I decided to take a shortcut through a quiet residential neighborhood. It looked perfectly normal. Small apartment buildings, vending machines glowing in the darkness, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I had walked only a few blocks when I noticed a woman standing beneath one of the lights. She wore a long beige coat. Dark hair covered part of her face. A white surgical mask hid the rest. That wasn't unusual. Many people in Japan wear masks. What caught my attention was the way she stood, perfectly still, not checking her phone, not looking around, just waiting. As I walked closer, she slowly turned toward me. I nodded politely and continued walking. She didn't move. When I passed her, I suddenly felt as though someone was walking behind me. I could hear footsteps, slow, perfectly matching my own. Every time I took a step, so did whoever was behind me. I kept walking. The footsteps continued. I told myself not to turn around. After nearly a minute, curiosity got the better of me. I looked back. The street was empty. The woman was gone. I laughed quietly at myself. I had almost convinced myself that fatigue was making me paranoid. Then I noticed something strange. The footsteps hadn't stopped. I could still hear them, even though no one was there. They continued behind me all the way to the next intersection. The moment I stepped beneath another streetlight, the footsteps ended. The woman was standing in front of me again. I never saw her pass me. She was simply there, exactly the same as before, mask, long coat, dark hair, motionless. This time she slowly tilted her head. The movement didn't feel human. It was too smooth, too slow. Then she raised one hand without speaking. She pointed toward her face. I felt my stomach tighten somewhere in the back of my mind. I suddenly remembered reading something online months earlier. A woman in a mask, a question, never answer. I couldn't remember the rest. I took a step backward. She took one step forward. The distance between us never changed. Another step, another. It didn't matter how quickly I moved. She always remained exactly the same distance away. as though the street itself refused to let either of us get closer or farther apart. Then she slowly reached for her mask. I closed my eyes. I don't know why, instinct maybe. I simply knew I didn't want to see what was underneath. Several seconds passed. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no wind. When I finally opened my eyes, the street was empty. I ran all the way back to my hotel. I told myself it had been nothing more than stress, an unusually convincing nightmare while awake. The next morning, I mentioned the experience to one of my coworkers. The moment I described the woman, he became completely silent. He refused to explain why. He only told me one thing: never walk home alone again. I listened. For the rest of the trip, I only traveled by taxi. Nothing unusual happened. I returned home believing the whole experience was over. It wasn't. About a month later, I was brushing my teeth before bed when I noticed someone standing behind me in the bathroom mirror. A woman, long dark hair, white mask. I spun around. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. That was the beginning. Over the following weeks, I started seeing reflections that didn't match reality. Sometimes a figure appeared in shop windows after I had already walked past. Sometimes I caught the outline of someone standing behind me on my phone screen. Whenever I turned around, nothing. One rainy evening, I stopped at a convenience store after work. As I opened the refrigerator door, I caught another reflection in the glass. She was standing directly behind me, closer than ever before. I dropped everything and turned. The aisle was completely empty. Only the cashier stood near the entrance. He looked confused, apparently. I had shouted without realizing it. I stopped sleeping properly. I avoided mirrors whenever possible. Eventually, I covered every reflective surface inside my apartment. The bathroom mirror, the bedroom mirror, even the microwave door. For a while, it actually helped. Then something changed. One morning, I looked down at my phone while it was still turned off. The black screen reflected my face, only it wasn't my face. The corners of my mouth stretched much farther than they should have. The smile reached almost to my ears. I touched my cheeks. They felt perfectly normal. The reflection continued smiling. I wasn't. The screen suddenly lit up. The reflection disappeared. I stood there shaking for several minutes. That should have been enough. I should have thrown the phone away. Instead, I convinced myself I was imagining everything. 3 nights ago, I woke because someone was breathing beside my bed. Slow, steady, I didn't move. I kept my eyes closed. The breathing continued for almost a minute, then it stopped. I opened my eyes. No one was there, but the bedroom door stood open. I always lock it before sleeping. Last night, I installed a security camera inside my apartment. I wanted proof, either proof that I was losing my mind, or proof that something else was happening. This morning I reviewed the footage. For nearly 7 hours, nothing unusual appeared. Then at exactly 3:13 a.m. I sat upright in bed. My eyes opened. I climbed out of bed, walked to the bedroom door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. The strange part is, I have absolutely no memory of doing any of it. The camera continued recording. For almost 12 minutes, I never came back into the bedroom. At 3:25, someone finally walked back inside. It looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same face, same haircut. The only difference was the smile. It stretched impossibly wide across my face. The camera captured one more detail before the recording ended. As the figure climbed back into my bed, it slowly reached up and pulled a white surgical mask off its face. I never believed that a public restroom could become the most terrifying place in my life. If someone had told me that an ordinary bathroom inside a modern office building could be haunted by an old Japanese legend, I would have laughed. Now I avoid public restrooms whenever I can. It happened during a business trip to Osaka. I had spent the entire day attending meetings inside a large office complex. By the time everyone left, I stayed behind to finish a report that needed to be submitted before morning. Around 10 o'clock that night, I realized I had been working for nearly 6 hours without taking a break. The entire floor was empty. The lights in most offices had already turned off automatically. Only the emergency lighting remained, casting long shadows across the hallways. I walked toward the nearest restroom. Everything seemed completely normal. The lights were on. The sinks were spotless. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant. I entered the last stall because it was the cleanest one. The moment I locked the door, the lights went out, not flickering, not dimming, they simply disappeared. The restroom fell into complete darkness. At first, I assumed it was a power outage. I reached for my phone. The screen wouldn't turn on. The battery had been almost full only minutes earlier. Then I heard something, a voice, calm, slow, close enough that it sounded like someone was standing just outside the stall. It asked me a single question. It wanted to know whether I wanted the red paper or the blue paper. The words were spoken so softly that they almost sounded polite. I had never heard the legend before. The question meant nothing to me. I stayed silent. The voice asked again. Exactly the same words, exactly the same tone. The silence inside the restroom became unbearable. No air conditioning, no dripping water, no sounds from the building outside, only that voice. Waiting, I reached beneath the stall door, expecting to feel empty space. Instead, my fingers touched fabric. Someone was standing directly outside. I couldn't see their feet, only the hem of what felt like a long robe. I slowly pulled my hand back. The fabric felt strangely cold, almost wet. The voice asked the question a third time. This time, it sounded disappointed. The stall door rattled gently, once, then again, not violently, almost patiently, like someone checking whether it had been locked. I climbed onto the toilet seat, trying not to make a sound. A few seconds later, I saw something slide beneath the gap at the bottom of the door. A strip of deep red cloth. It moved slowly across the floor like it had been pushed by an invisible hand. It stopped directly beneath me, then another piece appeared, dark blue. The two strips lay side by side. Waiting, I didn't touch either one. Several minutes passed, nothing happened. Then, the cloth slowly began moving again, not away from me, toward me. It crept across the tiles inch by inch until the red fabric touched the toe of my shoe. At that exact moment, the lights came back on, everything vanished. No cloth, no shadow, no voice. The restroom looked perfectly ordinary. I unlocked the stall and almost ran back to my office. I packed my laptop and left the building immediately. I never told anyone what had happened. I convinced myself stress had caused some kind of waking dream. That explanation lasted less than a week back home. I began noticing red and blue objects everywhere. 2 folders left on my desk, 1 red, 1 blue, 2 umbrellas outside my apartment, 1 red, 1 blue, 2 coffee mugs in the office kitchen, 1 red. 1 blue. I had never paid attention to colors before. Now they seemed impossible to ignore. At first I thought I was simply becoming paranoid. Then the voice returned, not in a restroom, inside an elevator. I was alone, halfway between floors. The elevator stopped unexpectedly. The lights dimmed, then I heard the same calm voice behind me. It asked the same question. I spun around immediately. No one was there. The elevator resumed moving before I could react. The doors opened. The hallway outside was empty. Over the following months, the encounters became more frequent. The voice followed me into subway stations, airport restrooms, shopping malls, even the bathroom in my own apartment. It never became louder. It never sounded angry. It simply continued asking, always patiently, always waiting. I eventually searched online and discovered the old legend of Manto. Most websites described different endings depending on how someone answered. Some claimed choosing either color led to death. Others insisted refusing to answer was the only way to survive. Reading those stories made one detail suddenly stand out. The voice had never asked me to choose. It had always asked me which paper I wanted. Somehow, that felt different. Last month I decided to move. A new apartment, a new city, a fresh start. I thought distance might finally end whatever had attached itself to me. The first night in my new home, everything felt peaceful. Until I woke around 3 in the morning. I needed to use the bathroom. As I reached for the light switch, I noticed something beneath the closed bathroom door. 2 narrow strips of paper had been pushed underneath, 1 red, 1 blue. I backed away immediately. I didn't open the door. I left the apartment before sunrise and spent the rest of the day in a hotel. When I returned that evening, the bathroom looked completely normal. No paper, no footprints, nothing. Yesterday, I installed security cameras throughout the apartment. I wanted proof, something that would finally tell me whether I was imagining everything. This morning, I reviewed the footage. At 2:58 a.m., my bathroom door slowly opened by itself. No one came out. A moment later, 2 pieces of paper slid quietly across the floor into my bedroom, exactly as I remembered. Then the recording captured something I still can't explain. A shadow stepped out of the bathroom. It wore what looked like a long crimson cloak. Its face remained hidden. The figure stood beside my bed for nearly 10 minutes, watching me sleep. Just before returning to the bathroom, it slowly leaned toward my ear, even though the camera recorded no sound. I already know exactly what it asked, because when I woke up this morning, the question was still echoing inside my head, and the worst part is, after hearing it for almost a year, I'm starting to wonder what would happen if I finally answered.